Good morning. Welcome to the Pastor's Bible class. We are continuing our series Back to the Basics, a Firm Foundation. And we've been tracking through some of the key events and people in the book of Genesis. And today we focus on this guy named Joseph. We're going to cover a lot of material. The story of Joseph comprises 13 chapters. But we're not going to deal with all of them, but we're going to hit bits and pieces of several of the chapters in order to help you understand how God continues to work through broken and fallible people, and in a world that is broken by betrayal, by hardship, by false accusation. Through it all, God is at work accomplishing his plan, which is the salvation of his people. So we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 37. You can download the study guide and follow along. But we're going to pick up with Genesis 37, verses 1 through 11. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed. And you remember last week we were talking about Jacob and Jacob's ladder. He's now back in the promised land, in the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah, and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers. They hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." For people who already didn't like the guy, this isn't giving them any confidence that they should like him.
I know, right?
Okay? His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, as if they would be excited. "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So, before we get to actually Joseph, let's talk about Jacob for a second.
Yeah.
Jacob could have written a manual on how not to be a good parent. What was he doing that was so injurious to the family?
The same thing his parents did, which is often kind of how this works. But his parents had favorites.
Yep.
His dad loved his older brother more than he loved him. And his mom loved him more than he loved his older brother Esau. And he does the same thing with his kids.
Yeah.
Part of this is because it's not just a son of his old age, it's actually a son of his favored wife, too.
Yeah.
So it's like there's a lot going on in this section, why he might have favored Joseph over the other sons that he had. It's not good.
Yeah, I think it happens probably in most families. I know we've had that discussion. After my mom and my dad died, and all the brothers are there with their wives, we're sitting around reminiscing. And, well, who was the favorite? well, we know that my brother Joe was my mom's favorite, and I was probably my dad's favorite, and we're all agreeing on this stuff. And so my two other brothers, Mike and Brian, well, they're just kind of out in the cold, okay? But although my mom tried to be, impartial, we said that. My kids did the same thing. Bethany claims that Daniel was our favorite. Daniel claims that Bethany was our favorite. It's just a part of the sinful nature.
But the problem for Jacob was he was unashamedly showing his favoritism.
Yeah. in Austin when our second grandson was born. And we were at a pastor's conference, but we were going to visit our grandson who had just been born about a week earlier. And so we saw Pastor Bars, Mark Bars from San Antonio. And he asked if we were going to go out to dinner with the rest of the pastors. And I said, no, we're going to go to our son and daughter-in-law's house because they just had a baby. And so he asked, well, how many grandkids? I said, well, this is the second. And he says, isn't it amazing in God's economy that the more you have, the more you get to share? In the sense that you would think, oh, now we have 2 kids, who are we going to love more? No. God loves both kids equally and abundantly, and his resources of love never run dry.
Right.
You know, that should be the goal.
Right.
Jacob doesn't hit that spot.
Not in the least.
So, and you've already addressed the question number 2. He learned this from his parents. And we do tend to repeat what we've learned, what we've seen in our parents. It doesn't have to be that way.
No.
But by the grace of God, he can break very bad forms and rebuild them into very good forms. Or, as I like to say, you can start a new legacy. Just because you've had a destructive family doesn't mean that you have to raise your children, they have to raise their children in that way of destruction.
Right.
By the grace of God, he turns people around. That's called repentance.
Right.
So that we can start experiencing life.
Yeah.
So what's the essence of Jacob's or Joseph's dream?
So it's the big picture version is somehow Joseph is going to be kind of top whatever in the family at some point, even above Jacob and the parents. Like somehow they're going to, I guess, have authority. They interpreted it as having authority over them, like ruling or reigning over them, even though Joseph doesn't, supply that interpretation of the dream. That's inferred by the family.
Yeah.
Later on, we're going to find out he actually can interpret dreams.
Right.
Or God gives him interpretation, but that's not what we get here.
And how old is Joseph at the time?
He's 17 and not really adept at reading the room.
No. He doesn't know his audience.
No, because just as you were reading, I was thinking about this going, man, how is he missing the fact that his brothers cannot speak peaceably to him?
Yeah.
And that he just is like going, hey guys, I had this really cool dream last night. I thought it was pretty awesome.
And in a healthy family unit, you would say that's kind of natural because you had this dream, so you tell it to the people who you think love you, or hopefully do love you, and you just talk about it. It doesn't go down very well with his brothers. That just gives them another reason to despise him even more. Before we read the next section of Scripture, it does lead us to ask a question, what was going on in the hearts of Joseph's brothers?
Yeah.
And just as a general outline, the early Christian church and Christian tradition identified 7 deadly sins. And they were considered deadly because these behaviors or these feelings often led or inspired further sins. So it was this monopoly type effect that you were getting more and more and more because of these 7 deadly sins, getting more and more, not good stuff, but bad stuff, more sins. And so what are the 7 deadly sins? Give us one of them.
So the first one is, the first one on your list, but one of them is pride.
Yeah.
And pride chains off because all of a sudden pride says, ultimately, I don't need God. I'm the only thing I need, and I'm the best, and everything's about me. And you can see if you've experienced that what comes out of that is a selfishness, you start using people. I mean, I don't have to go very far for everyone to see this chains off into bad things really quickly.
Well, and it's interesting, when I was doing some research on this, and I didn't do an exhaustive research, but I looked at several different lists of 7 deadly sins. Guess which one was number 1 on every list? Pride.
Yeah.
Because when we elevate ourselves, we're automatically breaking the first commandment. And as the scriptures teach us, when you break the first commandment, you're breaking them all.
It just has a ripple effect.
So the first is pride. The second one is something that we're familiar with. Now, I think it was Leonardo DiCaprio. No, it was Michael Douglas who says, greed is good. No, it's not.
No.
You know, and that's the second deadly sin. Greed leads to other sins. You've got to have more. And it's amazing what we will do to people or how we will live our lives in order to get what we want. And so greed would be the second deadly sin. What's the third?
The third one is lust. Lust is one of the things that we actually see. It's not in the sections that we're going to talk about today, but you look at the sons of Israel, these 11, 12 kids. Man, they got problems, and lust is one of them.
And it's certainly not something that is confined to the days of Scripture.
Oh, absolutely not.
Lust is still a big issue in our culture today.
Yeah.
It will continue to be a big issue, by the way, until Christ returns.
Yeah.
So,
for sure.
The fourth of the 7 deadly sins is envy or jealousy.
These two kind of work together, lust, envy, jealousy. They both kind of do the same thing, is they really go at wreck relationships because they cause us to see people as something less than or different than they are.
Yeah.
Lust being, I see you for what you can do for me.
Yep.
And then envy and jealousy, you're seeing people as, you have what I want.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden, they're not human. They're not reflections, images of God, broken as they are, but they're now objects.
They become commodities for me to use as I want to get what I want.
The next one you got on your list, I think, is something that we struggle with in the United States rather grievously, is gluttony.
Well, we had a microcosm of that last year with the toilet paper run.
Yeah.
And they had video clips on the news, people actually fighting over toilet paper because someone had a whole cart full,
right,
and someone just wanted one roll, and so they're duking it out over toilet paper.
Yeah.
The next one is wrath or / anger. You know, we lash out, and you can see how that wrath and anger are often associated with the pride. You know, you have injured me. I think of the football player from the New England Patriots, Hernandez. He had everything, but he committed murder, and when they asked him why, it's because this guy dissed him. And it was a friend of his. He knew him, but he didn't want to be dissed in public, and so he murders him because it hurt his pride, and that spills out in anger. How dare you do that to me?
Right.
And he lashes out, and I mean, we all know how anger can be so destructive.
That anger, then, it just has ripple effects that are across generational and generations. I mean, you think about whole families whose sort of outlook on life. How do you deal with one another? It's in anger.
It used to be kind of rare. Now it's commonplace. You turn on the news and you see incidences of road rage. You know, it's just crazy.
Yeah.
And then the last one,
sloth, laziness. Just the idea of, if you don't get stuff that you need to get done, it can have ripple effects from everything to your job, to your food on the table, to your relationships. It just has a ripple effect across the board.
Yeah. And we're just doing this overview simply because we're going to see some of these 7 deadly sins which inspire other sins at work in the texts that we will be looking at.
Verse 12 of Genesis 37. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. Apparently, Israel didn't read the room very well either. And he said to him, and Joseph said, here I am. And so Jacob said to him, now see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So he sent him to the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, what are you seeking? He said, I'm seeking my brothers. And he said, tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock. And the man said, well, they've gone away, like that way, for I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. Now they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him.
And by the way, you probably saw him from afar because he's wearing this pretty awesome coat. Hey, we know who's wearing that.
Shiny. Who's that? Oh, great. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty, and there wasn't any water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And apparently Reuben had gone off because, something happens here that Reuben was not aware of. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming down from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, and they're on their way down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh."
So compassionate.
I know, right?
We'll just sell him into slavery.
Yeah, because we're nice guys.
Yeah.
And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by. And then we got a time out here for just a second. One of the things we talked about last week was how Moses loves to use if there are multiple names to be used for a place, a person, or a people, he'll use them. And this is one of those sections. So he says Ishmaelites, but Midianites, this is drilling down to a specific kind of tribe of Ishmaelites at that point. It's the same group of folks. So the Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. Now, when Reuben returned, because remember, he had said, "No, do this," and apparently he had left to go do something and wasn't there for selling the brother, and saw Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and I, where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in his blood. They sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not."
Yeah, we're pretty sure it's his because we took it off him before we sold him into slavery.
But we wanted you to double check to make sure. Yeah. And he identified it. "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard.
Oh, so, you've already alluded to it, at least one of the deadly sins that were gripping the brothers' hearts, and that was
anger.
Yeah.
Wrath.
And jealousy. Those things were. But now a new one comes in, especially it's revealed in Judah's heart. What's in Judah's heart?
Greed. Yeah. Let's make some profit off this kid and not just kill him.
Yeah, no sense in killing him if we can't benefit from it.
Yeah, right.
So, but this way we don't have to kill him and we can get some money and everybody will be happy. And as we were talking beforehand, you made the comment, "Bye, Joseph, have fun in Egypt."
One of the other deadly sins that shows up here is pride for Reuben. Because Reuben thinks he's going to be able to save Joseph from the brothers and maybe get into better stead with his dad.
Yeah. Well, and he may have hated Joseph just as much as the other brothers, but it does illustrate the degrees of evil because of the 7 deadly sins. He may have hated him, he may have been jealous of him, but he was not willing to murder him.
Right.
Whereas the other brothers had no qualms about murdering him until Judah comes up with the great idea, well, no, let's not murder him, let's just sell him into slavery and make money off it. Sometimes when people view the Bible, they think it is some type of Pollyanna type story that is unrealistic, everything's good and kind. One of the great blessings of the Bible is that it is painfully honest and realistic. It's not some fantasy world that the Bible is addressing. It's our world.
Yeah.
It's the world that is so broken by sin, we do incredibly evil and wicked things.
Right. And yet, as we're going to see here, it's not going to be by human hands that Joseph is rescued.
Yeah.
And it's never, and the same thing for us out of our sin. Like, I love this in point 6, Reuben to the rescue. Reuben's thinking he's going to save Joseph when it's going to take somebody far more powerful than Reuben to save Joseph. And not just save Joseph, but actually save millions from starvation.
Yeah. The brothers certainly thought, well, that's the end of this dreamer. We didn't have to murder him, but he is gone. We will never hear of him. We will never see him again.
Yeah.
They were in control of the situation. They were controlling the circumstances and their destiny and Joseph's.
Yeah.
Little did they know that they weren't.
Yeah,
So-
that's right.
Which brings us then to Genesis 37, brings us to Genesis 39.
Right.
The end of 37 ends with Joseph going down to Egypt. He's sold now to Potiphar, who is an official of Pharaoh. And we're just going to hit some of the highlights, because if we don't hit some of these chapters and fill in the blanks, where we're going is not going to make any sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So in 39, Joseph is now sold to Potiphar. And because God is gracious to him, because God is at work, Joseph is elevated in Potiphar's household.
Right.
He's running the place.
Right, we see this again and again, that God's like this looks terrible, but Joseph is in pretty much the best darn situation he could be.
And
in
everyone
this
lived
one.
happily ever after, right?
Yeah, no.
Wrong.
Joseph's a pretty handsome guy, and Joseph has the favor of everybody in that household. That's what we're given to Scripture. That's what Moses reminds us of. And so he's really favored by Potiphar's wife.
Yeah. And what does she want?
She wants him to be her lover.
Yeah. And so she keeps on trying to seduce him. But what we see in Joseph is this is a guy who's a man of character.
Yeah.
He does love God. And because of that, he is not going to do things that he knows are contrary to God's will. Even though the temptation is all around him and
Right.
she is pursuing him, he will not do it.
Right.
So what does she do?
She basically corners him into a situation where she can accuse him of trying to rape her.
Yeah, she grabs him and pulls
Pulls
him onto the bed. And Joseph, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to sin against my master like this.
Well, Joseph does what Paul will do later on when he talks about sexual sin, which is he flees, he runs. And that's, really kind of the only way to get out of that was to flee. Only he left behind something.
He left behind his robe. And so now she has evidence to concoct this story. Oh, he tried to assault me. He tried to rape me. And here's what he left behind when he fled in a hurry because he heard me scream.
Right.
And so Potiphar believes his wife and is furious with Joseph. And he goes from being second in command in that household to being thrown into prison. So he's sold by his brothers. Now he's cast into prison by his master Potiphar.
On false accusations.
And it looks like, man, this is terrible. And yet, what happens in the prison?
Well, the same thing that happened in Potiphar's household. All of a sudden, we get this picture of Joseph being like really well favored by the guard, by the master of the guard there, right? By the prison warden loves Joseph. Like, this guy's trustworthy. I'm going to put him in charge of the other prisoners. He's going to kind of be like my go-to, my go-between for these guys.
And Moses makes it clear in the text, and again, we're not going to be reading all this, it's because God favored him.
Yeah.
God was not oblivious to the trials, the pains, the sufferings that Joseph was going through. And God favors him, and he continues to work good out of bad situations that occur in Joseph's life.
Yeah.
So, we realize that God is the one who is doing it, but he works through people.
Right.
So if you're going through a difficult time right now, and you're about to throw up your hands saying, man, there is no hope, well, the truth is, yeah, there is, because God knows exactly what is going on in your situation, in your life, and he is faithful to his covenant promise.
Which is why we still see the gifts of God continuing to be poured out and used even in the middle of prison.
Yep.
Because Joseph, now he gets this great ability from God to interpret dreams.
Yeah. Which brings us then to chapter 40, so that he's in prison, and two other officials from Pharaoh's household join him. One was the cupbearer who used to put the wine in his hand, and one is his baker who used to give him the bread. And they're in prison because they fell out of favor with Pharaoh. and then they both have dreams. And now Joseph is given the ability to interpret the dreams.
Yeah.
And he interprets them correctly. The cupbearer is restored.
Right.
And the baker is executed.
Exactly in the way that Joseph interpreted the dream that would happen.
Yeah.
He's like, and when?
Yeah.
He said, within X amount of time, this is going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, and then something interesting happens, though, at the end of the chapter 40. He's like, dude, to the cupbearer, say something to Pharaoh about me, okay? Get me out of here.
Yeah.
Only the cupbearer forgets to say something.
He forgets until chapter 41 when Pharaoh has 2 dreams.
Right.
And none of his magicians, sages, counselors can interpret it. Right. And all of a sudden the cupbearer goes, oh, yeah. Pharaoh, I'm really sorry, but remember when you were mad at me and so you had me thrown in prison and along with the baker? Well, there was a guy there who could interpret dreams. And I had a dream and the baker had a dream and he interpreted them spot on. It happened just the way he said in the time frame that he said. I forgot to tell you about that. Sorry. And so Pharaoh says, well, call him.
Right.
And so Joseph is cleaned up, and then he's brought into Pharaoh, and Pharaoh tells him the dream. The first dream is about these cows. One is really, really skinny. It comes out of the Nile. One is really, really fat. The fat one comes up first, and then the skinny one. The skinny one eats the fat one, and you look at the skinny one, it doesn't look like it's even had a lunch. You know. So what does this mean? And he's troubled by this. And then he sees heads of grain. There is a really full and bounteous head of grain, and then there's a really withered stalk. And the withered stalk consumes the full one, and it doesn't look like it's been touched at all. It's still withered. And he's troubled by this. And he says and there's 7 cows and 7 heads of grain. And he says, interpret this. No one can. Joseph is brought in. I love Joseph's humility.
Yeah, yes,
Because he says, hey, I'm told that you can interpret dreams.
It's not me.
No, I can't do it, but God can.
That's what I was looking at. I was like, I'm pretty sure it's right. God will give the interpretation, not me. God's the one who's giving this interpretation. I also, he gets there, and then he just lays it out. Like, I know you're the king, but here's the deal.
Yep.
There's going to be 7 bad years, 7 good years. You're going to have so much stuff, you're not going to know what to do with it all. And then you're going to have 7 years where there's nothing. 0.
And all the good stuff is going to be forgotten because it's going to be so bad. And Pharaoh says, well, what are we going to do about this? Who can manage this? And he comes to the conclusion, well, this guy that interpreted it, there's none like him in my whole realm. I'm going to elevate him. He's now second in command of all of Egypt.
No, and it's like, and then all of if you're reading this through, all the gears are starting to click into place right here. Like, wait, Joseph had a dream about something like this a few years back. Is this how it was going to come to pass?
Because in the dream, it was his brothers who come and bow down. We're not there yet, but we do know this dream is coming into fruition. And so he's put in charge because he not only could interpret the dream, he was a good strategizer. He had a plan to deal with this famine that was coming and the 7 years of bounty. And so he starts storing it away. In fact, they store so much of it, they can't even count it anymore. It's that much of a blessing during the 7 years. But then the light switch turns off, and all the rain goes away, and there's drought, and there's famine.
It's not just Egypt. It's Egypt. It's the Middle East.
Including Joseph's brothers.
Jacob
says, hey, we're going to starve to death if you guys don't get down to Egypt and get us some grain, because we heard that there's some down there. And so he sends 10 of his now 11 sons. He keeps the youngest one with him.
By the way, Joseph's only blood brother he keeps behind because it's the only son now of his favored wife that he's got left that he thinks.
So he's still showing favoritism. He just doesn't learn. Okay. So, but they go down, and then Joseph does some trickery. And one of them ends up in jail. He lets the others go back. But bottom line is, they come back after quite a long time, but this time they have to bring their younger brother because Joseph says, you told me the story, you're spies. He goes, no, we're the brothers and the sons of this one man, and they tell him his whole story, and they talk about the youngest son that's still with Jacob. And so Joseph says, bring him back, I know you're telling the truth. If you don't bring him back, you're spies. And they hold one of the brothers.
And the one brother here, well, you don't want to know what happens to him if you don't come back.
We're not good to spies.
Yeah.
And so the bottom line is, after a time, because Jacob is not willing to send Benjamin back with them. He's already lost Joseph. He's not going to lose Benjamin. But then push comes to shove. He doesn't have any choice. So they come back a second time with their younger brother. And then we pick up in chapter 45, verses 1 to 10, where after all this machination and trickery, Joseph actually reveals himself to his brothers. And so I'm reading in the NIV text, chapter 45, starting at verse 1. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And the context is he invited them for a meal. So they were with them with the attendants, but he sends the attendants out. So there was no one there with him, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I'm Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will not be plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have.
It's chilling. Just goosebumps. How Joseph is able to say, God meant this for good. He saved lives because of how everything turned out. And, oh, by the way, I'm not mad. I'm not mad.
And I think it's really cool, and it just jumps out at me. Not only does it say, I'm not mad, I'm forgiving you, but he also says, don't be mad at yourselves. I've forgiven you. You got to forgive yourself. What you did was wrong. There's no question about it, but God works through the wrong because God is in control, and what you thought you were doing to get rid of me was actually God's plan and purpose in order to save people's lives.
Because you see it again and again in this section leading up to this. The brothers say, this is because of what we did to Joseph. That's what they look back at that and they go, we're suffering because of what we did to Joseph. And it's like Joseph's like, guys, quit beating yourselves up. It's done, and God used it for good.
I think that is a marvelous description of confession and absolution. We do need to confess. We need to turn our sin over to the one who can deal with it and receive forgiveness. But once we've confessed, it's time to start living as actually forgiven people. And that's a part of the trust and the belief. Do we really believe that when Jesus says that we're forgiven, we're forgiven? And if Jesus really has forgiven us, why do we
hold on to this stuff?
Spend that time beating ourselves up over things that have been already forgiven. And then we're going to conclude with Genesis 50, verse 10.
Right, we've skipped ahead a few years at this point, and then there's an interesting situation. It's just amazing how sometimes we hold on to stuff. You think it's done, and then something happens, and all of a sudden it all rears its ugly head. we're in Genesis chapter 50, verses 15 through 21, sort of concludes this whole narrative of Joseph. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. Can I just make a timeout here and briefly say that we often sort of smuggle our own issues onto other people. And they assume because that's how they would have operated or did.
That's how they did operate, yeah.
Yeah, how they operated, that would be how Joseph would operate. When it couldn't be further from the truth. And yet, how often do we do that to other people?
And even to God.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't always believe that God has fully forgiven us because we don't always forgive others.
Right.
Especially when they have hurt us deeply.
So it's more about, it's about us, and it's a reflection of who we are rather than who the person we're worried about is.
Right.
Anyhow, verse 16. So they sent a message. They didn't even go to Joseph's presence. They just sent a message to Joseph, a messenger. He's like, we want to be able to run if this is the case. Saying, your father gave this command before he died, which he didn't give, by the way. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. I love that. They're even like, hey, we're going to lie about this. And say dad said something that he didn't actually say. And now, please forgive the transgressions of your servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Now, just think about it. It hurt him so much for them to not trust him.
Yeah, and I don't think he's weeping for himself.
No.
He is weeping for them because they have so little trust.
Yep. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them.
It's basically the same thing that he said in 45.
Yeah.
But a couple years have passed.
Yeah.
And they start doubting his faithfulness. Because, again, it's a reflection of who they are.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is, as you said, this is how we approach God. And we even approach like Jesus. And we need Jesus. Like the disciples in the New Testament, Jesus has to go to them again and again and again and say, don't be afraid.
Yeah.
Because their issue with the situation was all a reflection of their heart.
Yep.
Not a reflection of Jesus's promises, his goodness, and his mercy,
right,
which we still see today.
And if you've been with us since the beginning of this this series, you know that we started with creation and Adam and Eve, the fall in Genesis chapter 3.
Yeah.
And after they fall, when God comes, they hide from him because they're afraid.
Now, it's not because of anything God has done.
Right.
It is because of everything what they now are interpreting God and putting on God and saying, well, God's going to react this way to us, and because that's how we react to each other.
We're dead.
Yeah.
Basically what the brothers were saying.
Yeah.
But Joseph gives grace and forgiveness. God gives grace and forgiveness not only to Adam and Eve, but to us. Yeah. And we know that he's given it to us as we focus our eyes on the cross of Jesus Christ.
Which it goes then to your takeaways here, that sin destroys. And it destroys so much more than just like a thing or a situation. It destroyed trust. It destroyed relationships. Yeah. It destroyed any sort of sense of peace that the brothers might have had in their own hearts.
Yeah.
I mean, there was so much destruction that happened based out of that.
And that's what sin does. It always separates from God. It always alienates. It always destroys. Even if you feel like you've gotten away with it, there are negative, destructive consequences for the sin in our lives.
Yep.
Secondly, we see the antidote to sin, and that's what?
Forgiveness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me say that again. Forgiveness is the antidote to sin.
It's the only way to deal with it.
Yeah.
And truly, it's the only way to deal with it between people, and it's the only way we deal with it is by not dealing with it. God dealt with it in his son at the cross.
Well, that's why Jesus gives the keys of the kingdom to his people, the keys to forgive. Yeah. Because when we hold back, we not only are hurting the person that we refuse to forgive, we're hurting ourselves.
Yep.
And who wins? Satan.
Yep.
And so God turns the table on Satan. He says, you know what? I'm not giving people what they deserve.
Yep.
I'm going to give what they deserve to my son, who's going to pay for it completely, and I'm going to set them free from all that destructive behavior, from all that pain, from all that suffering. Even though we experience it in part still today because it's a broken world, the eternal consequences of our sin have been paid for by Christ, and that comes through forgiveness that flows from Calvary's cross. What is the third takeaway?
We know that sin is deadly. I mean, we talked about the deadly sins up above, but we've also just been through this whole narrative talking about how sin just destroys and hurts. Grace, on the other hand, that is receiving something that you don't deserve and could never earn, is what brings healing.
And you see that in Joseph. I mean, he was suffering unjustly. And a lot of times we bring suffering upon ourselves. That's not the case with Joseph, other than probably being a little bit naive, a little bit foolish because he didn't know his audience, talking about these things. He didn't bring that upon himself. It was the jealousy, the anger, the pride of the brothers that caused him to suffer much. But even in the midst of suffering, he experienced healing.
Yeah.
God was there in the midst of the suffering, and he kept on turning the tables, caring for Joseph and elevating him.
And that's number 4, the point 4, God uses suffering to serve his purposes. That's the thing where God's not just healing, but he's also then going to take that experience, take what has happened in that, and actually redeem it for something good.
Yeah.
That's how powerful our God is. He's not content to just heal. He's also in the business of redeeming and then using that for his good and for his own purposes and for the good of those who love him. And that's kind of like, wow, how awesome is our God?
Well, and the counterpart to that is Romans 8:28, where Paul says, all things, not just the good things, all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose.
This is why, as part of following Jesus, we live in a culture, and this is, maybe perhaps a little far-field, we live in a culture that says life is meaningless, including suffering. For the follower of Jesus, suffering's not meaningless.
That's right.
And that's part of what the hope is in the midst of suffering. It's going to serve a purpose at some point, even if we might not see the purpose of it. Just like Joseph spent 13 years not seeing the purpose of that suffering until, nearly half his life, 13 years. Eventually the purpose was made known. Yeah,
and the truth is, we may not understand why we suffer ever this side of eternity.
Yeah.
But once we get to heaven, as Paul says, we will know as we are known.
Yeah.
And I'm convinced, a lot of people say, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask. And so, but once we get to heaven, we're going to look back and go, wow, God, you are so awesome. Now I see how you were working through it all. Right now, we take it by faith that God is working.
Yes.
Sometimes we get the blessing, like Joseph, how it works out in this life. Sometimes we don't, but one day we will, and all that's going to do is fill our hearts with more gratitude for the awesomeness of God.
Which then leads us to your final point, which regardless of whether we can see how God's working or not, what we get from this narrative is that God reigns over the good and the evil. He hasn't lost control, even though Joseph certainly could have looked at the situation and said he had lost complete control of what was going on. God was still in control.
And God still calls good, good, and evil, evil. He's not saying that, oh no, it's all a part of my plan, so there's really no good or evil.
Right.
You guys are just puppets or pawn pieces on my cosmic chessboard. That's not what he does. He says, what we do at times is evil. It's contrary to his will, his plan, and his purpose. And yet, even though we make really bad choices, God can still use it to bring good into this world. I want to end just with a true life story. A few years ago, someone came to the church and they were telling me their story. And this guy had a really, really tough life. With drugs, with broken relationships. He was just down and out. But then he said, oh, it's all good. I said, no, it's not. I said, what you told me is not good at all.
Yeah.
It is a lot of pain and suffering and brokenness caused by sin. But it has all been forgiven. And so you get a fresh start. And I think we have to emphasize that. It's not all good. There's a lot of stuff in this world that's really, really bad.
Yeah.
It's evil. Yeah. And we have to remember that this is not the world God intended it to be, but he works in the midst of all this to accomplish his plans, which ultimately are good because it is the salvation of his people from evil.
Anyhow, thank you all for
joining us.
joining us.
Have a great day in the Lord.
Yeah, take care.